Russians. Now, Russian Sophiology, which is probably the variety of Sophiology that, if a person's heard of it, this is usually the one they've heard of, because it has had some attention paid to it in Eastern Orthodox circles, and a little bit more than before in Catholic circles. Not a lot, but it's there. Russian Sophiology is the horizon of theology, in a way, or even not just Russian Sophiology, but Russian Sophiology shows it to be the horizon of theology, the horizon of philosophy, that where we reach the limit. It's as far as we can see. And if we can see that far, that's where we see Sophia. That's where the invisible and the invisible meet, or the conceptual and the unknowable meet. Which is why it's so confusing. And the Russians were the first ones who tried to systematize theologies of Sophia, or philosophies of Sophia. This is why they're really confusing. They're multifaceted, and the milieu in which Solovyev wrote, for instance, the 19th century, they were really, they were playing the positivist game, so everything had to have a rational explanation and definitions, and to give definitions is the anti-Sophiology in a way, because it's impossible to articulate what it is. So, for an example, let's hear what Solovyev said in a lecture on Auguste Comte in 1898. He says, Sophia, the divine wisdom, approximates now to Christ, now to Our Lady, thus not admitting of complete identification either with him or with her. This great royal and feminine being, which is not God, not the eternal Son of God, not an angel, not a saint, is no other than the true, pure, and perfect humanity, the highest and all-embracing form in the living soul of nature and of the universe, united to God from all eternity, and in the temporal process attaining union with him and uniting to him all that is. That is one heck of a definition. But it's, you got to try someplace, I suppose. But, you can see in that definition, if we can call it that, it segues from almost an apophatic, negative theology saying Sophia is not Christ, not the Virgin. But by saying she's not, he's almost saying, but she is, So, and then of course going later in this definition to talking about how Sophie is that unites God to united to God from all eternity and the temporal process. So unites eternity and time, and also unites union with God and uniting to God all that is. I always think of Sophia as a catalyst in this regard. Like, she's the catalytic converter of the world. She's the thing that connects the divinity to the creation. It's the best way I can talk about it. Now, Solovyev was born in 1853. It's interesting human being. I mean, first of all, probably the greatest Russian philosopher of his age, but also a mystic, also apparently an outrageously funny and practical joker in real life, and he went through an interesting progression to become a Sophiologist. And he's also, in a way, more than Bulgakov and Florensky, who also talk about, he's kind of a wild card. He's the hardest one to keep down on the plantation of the Eastern Orthodox. That's why a lot of Eastern Orthodox think of him as a heretic or a Gnostic. But his Sophiology begins when he's 9 years old at Divine Liturgy and during the cherubic hymn, which, let us who mystically represent the cherubim. That's how it starts. during the Divine Liturgy, he has this vision of this woman who is smiling at him and holding out to him a blue flower. So when he identified it as his eternal friend, he never called her Sophia in his poetic writing, but his eternal friend. And then, he, like a little kid, like any kid, he gets a little bit older, he hits his teenage years and decides he's an atheist. And then goes through a few years of atheism, starts to go back to religion. After he finished his schooling and his doctorate, he decided to go to London to study at the British Museum, where they have several manuscripts, Coptic, I think, and maybe probably Greek, some other languages, that talk about Sophia. This is probably what G.R.S. Mead studied when he translated the Pistis Sophia. So there's, Vladimir Solovyev, kind of living meagerly in London, but he spent all day in the British Museum studying these manuscripts. And while he was studying one, he's kind of thinking, I wish I could see her again. And then his face appears to him in the library, and she says, "Meet me in the desert." So what's he do? He goes to the desert. He gets up, I don't know if it was very soon, I don't know if it was the next day or anything, but he gets a ticket for a steamer, goes to Cairo, gets off the boat. I mean, this guy's really getting right off the boat. And he's dressed all in black. Got a black top hat on. He looks like a European of the age. And he's walking around the desert. He doesn't know where he's going. He's walking around the desert looking for Sophia. And in the meantime, some Bedouins jumped him. They thought he was the devil. And they figured, well, the devil should be rich. We should rob him. And they didn't have any money on him. So they didn't have much to give. And they left him. And then he wakes up in the middle of the night and has this third vision of Sophia, which kind of defined who he was. The French Marxist or Maoist philosopher Alain Badiou talks about the event of truth. And I think for Solovyev, these three meetings were the event. This is what the truth is. And he wouldn't go, he's not turning back from that truth. And he pursued that truth, and he maintained fidelity to it to the end of his life. In fact, his fidelity was so great that, and not only to the truth of Sophia, but his Christian belief that when there was an assassination attempt on the Tsar, and the response to such an attempt was execution. Solovyev said, as a Christian nation and as a Christian, the Tsar should forgive these guys. And as a result, Solovyev was forbidden to teach or to speak in public. And he took his medicine. And that's how he lived. And so he barely eked out a living for the rest of his life because he was basically prevented from having a career. Now, so to back up a little bit, so you can't talk about Sophiology any place without talking about Jakob Burma. And Burma, his works were eventually translated into Russian, and I guess there's I don't know if it's still there, but Solovyev's nephew, Sergei, who became a Byzantine Rite Catholic priest in the Russian church. He tells us of copies of Burma's writings, and I think the Philadelphians that were in the library in Moscow that had Solovyev's marginalia, because he apparently didn't respect the don't write in the library books rule, and he wrote all over the place in these books. So in the 19th century, these works started to be translated into Russian, which was, a big reason that this explosion happened in Russia. In fact, there had been a couple people who, in the 17th century, early 18th century, had tried to promulgate Beaminism in Russia, and they were martyred. They were executed in Red Square. So it was a dangerous undertaking. And it was still dangerous in Solovyev's time. What made it less dangerous is there was, just like in the rest of Europe, there was a growing tide of atheism or skepticism. So you could probably get away with something like this then. Though it didn't make him very popular with the Russian church. Now, Solovyev took all this stuff, and Urs von Balthasar writes about this. He talks about, he sucks up all these Gnostic and heterodox sources, and in Balthasar's opinion, when they run through Solovyev, they get purified. That might be overstating the case. But nevertheless, Solovyev was an extraordinary human being in that he living this fidelity to this vision of Sophia. And he didn't live very long either. He only made it to 47 years old. Most of the last decade, it was like he was sick quite often. He had a horrible health pattern. He didn't eat well, didn't take care of himself, and didn't live long as a result. But while he was in his last months of living, no one really knew he was going to die. He wrote a book called 3 Conversations. And in this, he tells a really kind of famous, probably might be the thing he's most known for in the West. He wrote a short story of the Antichrist, which is a pretty remarkable and pretty prescient, talking about the rise of Islam and basically saying, prophesying the European Union and a lot of the problems we encounter with religion right now. With religion, the 3 major faiths are reduced to almost to rubble. Pardon me. And in the narrative of the Antichrist, finally before the second coming, the three major religions, in just remnants of them, unite because they're under attack by the Antichrist. In fact, and it's very kind of heavy-handed in symbolism. The Pope is Pope Peter II, and then the leader of the Orthodox is Elder John, and the leader of the Protestants is Ernst Pauli, so Peter, John, and Paul. In presaging the second coming, the second coming never happens. What happens in the story is the woman clothed with the sun shows up. Sophia shows up in the sky and leads them into the desert. Now, we talked a few lectures ago about that image, and Solovyev says that's his second coming, basically, is the union of everyone under Sophia. So interesting. A little side note: John Milbank has noted, and I don't really agree with him about this, but he has noted, and it's an interesting insight, that the emblem for the European Union is actually the emblem of the woman crowned with the stars. And if only the European Union knew this, they'd probably change it in a minute. So that's Solovyev's story. And he was tremendously influential to the philosophers and theologians who came after him, particularly 2 we're going to talk about today, Pavel Florensky and Sergei Bulgakov. Now, Florensky, I'll just talk a little bit about him. He was a Russian Orthodox priest, and he was very close friends with Bulgakov. And he was also good friends, or not as good friends, but he was still friends with Nikolai Berdyaev. And Florensky wrote this miraculous book called The Pillar and Ground of the Truth. It's a number of letters with emblems, and I have to think that Valentin Tomberg, when he wrote Meditations on the Tarot, was basing the structure on Florensky's book, which was not available in English until 1997, I think. And one of the letters that Florensky includes is a letter on Sophia. Now, he's pretty. Let me read you a little bit from him. And so Florensky. And he speaks in language very, very similar to Solovyev's. He said, Sophia is the great root of the whole creation. That is, Sophia is all integral creation and not merely all creation. Sophia is the great root by which creation goes into the intra-Trinitarian life and through which it receives life eternal from the one source of life. Sophia is the original nature of creation, God's creative love, which is shed abroad in our hearts by the Holy Spirit, which is given us unto us. That's a quote from Romans 5:5. For this reason, the true I of a deified person, his heart, is precisely God's love, just as the essence of divinity is intra-Trinitarian love. For everything exists truly insofar as it communes with the God of love, the source of being and truth. If creation is torn away from its root, an inevitable death awaits it. Wisdom itself says, I'm going to Proverbs 8, for whoso findeth me findeth life, and shall obtain favor of the Lord. But he that sinneth against me wrongeth his own soul. All they that hate me love death. Get that? All them that hate me love death. And interesting with Florensky, he was not just a theologian, or I said just. He was a great theologian, but he's called the Da Vinci of Russia. He designed the power grid, the first electric power grid for Russia as they were installing power. But this was under the Bolsheviks. And he, unlike his dear friend Bulgakov and Projayev and others, when all of these Russian religious people were leaving the country, because of fear of the Bolsheviks, not just fear, but the Bolsheviks said, get out or go to prison. Florensky decided to stay. And can you imagine, he would go to these meetings with all the Bolsheviks, all the communists, dressed in his cassock. What a symbol that is. Really, it's basically, take me next. And they did take him next. And he was executed in 1937. And he's considered a neo-martyr, a saint in the Russian Orthodox Church, at least the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia. An extraordinary figure. Also a gifted architect. He could do everything. Gifted mathematician. And a martyr. There's a poem in my book, Meditations in Times of Wonder, where I was going through a contemplation of martyrdom phase, and I was contemplating his martyrdom, and one of the things he talks about in the Pillar and Ground of the Truth, he associates Mary and Sophia with the color blue, and talks about how that's not just appropriate, but ontologically true. And I think about when he's executed, and if the blue steel of the bullet entered his skull, which opened up Sophia to him. I pray to him. And then third, we'll talk about Sergei Bulgakov. I mentioned him quite a few times already in these lectures. Bulgakov is, he looked like a bear, a big Russian bear. And he's like the primary theological architect of Sophiology. And he worked hard through many books in exile in France to articulate a theology of Sophia. And guess what? He got into trouble. The Russian Orthodox authorities, and he was rector of the Russian seminary in college in Paris. Didn't matter. He was in trouble, kind of put on trial. They told him, knock it off with the Sophia stuff, and he said, okay. And he kept doing it anyway. He wrote some extraordinary books, and for him, we'll talk about this here, Sophia is, like we heard already, the all-embracing unity. And he even talks about Sophia before he becomes a priest. Now, like Solovyev, he too went through a period where he was an atheist, and he was a Marxist for a while, and then he rejected Marxism and entered the church. He became a priest. He was a married priest. He also, as I mentioned before, he had these religious experiences before the Sistine Madonna in Dresden while he was there. And he also started to perceive Sophia shining through nature. He talks about this in his autobiography. And also, when he visited Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, he felt this presence. And he couldn't explain it because he wasn't religious yet, hadn't studied theology yet. But those are the things that kind of impelled him toward the church. And while he was in this period, but yet not yet a theologian or not yet a priest, he wrote a book called The Philosophy of Economy. And in The Philosophy of Economy, he talks about the Sophianic economy. And I write about this a little bit in my book Transfiguration. But in the Sophiological or Sophianic economy, it's an economy that bestows life. Compared to the economies we have now, I don't care if it's socialist, capitalist, whatever kind of economy, they kind of work on death, according to Bulgakov. And so in a Sophiological economy, we would be working with the forces of life. And this is something Steiner, too, in his threefold social order, is also trying to get to. There haven't been too many experiments with that. There's not enough money, apparently. Well, Bulgakov, I'll read you something from him here. He also wrote an extraordinary couple. It came out as a book, but he wrote them as articles on the Holy Grail, which people in the Eastern Church don't talk about the Holy Grail. In fact, people in the Western Church don't talk about the Holy Grail, but the Holy Grail is a Western legend or a mythos. But here's what he writes. This is in a book now called The Holy Grail and the Eucharist, which was put out by Lindisfarne Books in 1997. It is not surprising if this mystery, thinking about the Holy Grail, till now still unilluminated by the theological dogmatic consciousness, has lived only in the obscure presentiments of Christian legend and poetry, in which the holy myth is clouded by human imaginings, by romantic reveries. But at the appropriate time, this mystery can take center stage in the Christian world's consciousness. And then the holy treasure of Montserrat will catch fire with heavenly light and will lead the nations to meet the coming of Christ. The whole world is the Holy Grail, for it has received into itself and contains Christ's precious blood and water. And we talked about this with Steiner. The whole world is the chalice of Christ's blood and water. The whole world partook of them in communion at the hour of Christ's death. And the whole world hides the blood and water within itself. A drop of Christ's blood dripped upon Adam's head redeemed Adam. But also the blood and water of Christ that flowed forth into the world sanctified the world. The blood and water made the world a place of the presence of Christ's power, prepared for the world for its future transfiguration, for the meeting with Christ come in glory. The world has become Christ, for it is the holy chalice, the Holy Grail. Boy, these words have been so important in my own biography. This, in my work as a biodynamic farmer, this is how I think of what I'm doing. I'm participating in the redemption. Because if Christ's blood touched it, it is holy. And you think it just touched a spot in Jerusalem. It's not. It hit the whole thing. It permeates the entire thing. And this is what Burma would call the tincture, right? It didn't change the form, but you can't erase it. And it bestows life. So that's an important aspect of Sophiology that the Russians all do. I mean, all these Russians, they touch on that. They touch on not only the theological and philosophical implications of Sophia, but also, you could say, the biological implications of Sophia. You know, how Sophia's, how the Zoe of Christ shines through Sophia and regenerates the bios of the world. Now, there's so many implications that come with this. I mean, how do we then treat the earth? How do we then treat each other? These are important things to think about. So here we are. Again, this is we're at the horizon of theology and philosophy. We're actually at the horizon of ecology as well. Because at this horizon, we come to the Metaxu, where Sophia dwells. And you can't define it. You can't hold on to it. You have to be with it. You have to participate in it, but you can't possess it. If you try to possess it, it's like trying to grab something in a dream, right? You know, or fairy gold, right? There's a way to hold this without possessing it, and that's, I think, one of the mysteries of Sophiology. And that's where we let go of rationality and the conceptual, because rationality and concepts, those are modes of possession. Those are a way I take hold of something. But you can't take hold of this. You can only be present to it and let it work through you. And that is a lesson that we'll talk about next time when we discuss what I call the submerged reality, which is the Sophiology as it filters through or shines through Catholicism, meaning the Western Catholicism, Latin Rite Catholicism. And so we'll take that up next time.